Okay, now trade unions are demanding that employees fired for not wanting to vaccinate should be reinstated. Standard Bank has opted to rehire some of those employees it had fired earlier. Other companies, the likes of Old Mutual, are sticking to their guns despite unions threatening court action. Let's try and get an understanding here from a labour perspective. Talk to Osborne Molatudi, a labour lawyer, managing director at Molatudi Attorneys. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sure you've seen the reports, and trade unions are not happy, particularly, for example, at Standard Bank, where they've offered to rehire, but the unions say, no, we don't want to be rehired. That's a new process. We want to be reinstated. What can workers do in this case? And other companies like Old Mutual saying that, no, they're not going to change their mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy.
Thank you, Praden, and good to speak to you again. The challenge the trade unions have is that there's only one of the two ways to have an employee reinstated or even rehired, and that is through a CCMA award or a labor court if that particular employee has lodged a dispute with the CCMA or labor court, depending on the reason for challenging the termination by either Standard Bank, Old Mutual, or any other employer in terms of the old code that was regulating the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. So a gesture that Standard Bank is putting forward is one which one can call voluntary gesture, which if the union does not accept it, then Standard Bank may decide to withdraw it, or any other employer. But reinstatement is something that can be a bargaining tool for the trade unions. But without a CCMA award or a labor court judgment, it will be difficult for those trade unions to convince Standard Bank or any other employer that may have effected terminations in terms of the old code and depending on the reason that existed at the time.
But there's a new regulation now. We are under the public health regulations as gazetted a few months ago when the country ended its national state of disaster. How do those work? I mean, how do they intersect with this labor space? Do the unions have a case?
Well, unions will have a case if in the current state of affairs, some employers still want to pursue the implementation of mandatory vaccination policies in their workplace, amongst others requiring their staff and workers in general to wear masks when attending to the workplace. The case to say, but on what basis you want to implement this when the wearing of masks in the public area has been done away with by a minister of Home Affairs, sorry, not Home Affairs, but of Health. But at the same time, we must keep in mind that employers in general have an obligation to maintain and keep a safe working environment. And they may argue that by us continuing with the mandatory vaccination policy is in line with our obligation in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So the unions will have a case, but at the same time, the employers will have a basis to try and argue why they want to continue with mandatory vaccination policy.
What about rights of individuals to choose and in terms of our constitution? Do they come into play here? We heard that quite a lot earlier, Mr. Molatudi. Remember at the beginning of this whole issue of lockdowns and restrictions and vaccination that, no, you can't force us to vaccinate. And therefore some companies like the likes of Old Mutual and Discovery have said, no, there will be mandatory vaccination. What about individual rights and how do they intersect with this health space?
Braden, one of the unintended consequences that some of the employees who still prefer that mandatory vaccination policies still be in place may in fact threaten to take legal action against any employer who may want to remove mandatory vaccination policy. So that's another right you must keep in mind. They may say, we also have a right to a healthy and safe work environment, and therefore you can't just remove a mandatory vaccination policy without engaging us, because you still have the obligation in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Insofar as those who may refuse, to continue to be vaccinated in terms of the same policy, yes, they do have that choice, but they must live with that choice. You make a choice, you must live with the consequences, because not every right in our constitution, Praden, we all know this by now, it's absolute. So as long as whoever infringes upon that right may be able to justify that he or she is doing so for a valid and rational reason. And in this instance, the employers will argue that we are merely complying with our obligation in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and as well as after having conducted a proper risk assessment, then they will be able to justify that. So either party will have a choice, but they still need to be able to stand by that choices. And unfortunately, in the case of employees, Braden, is that they may stand a risk of losing their jobs. But we know that decisions have gone either way. Very recently there has been a decision where a CCMA commissioner, same facts, same employer, same company, says no, he doesn't agree with the implementation of mandatory vaccination policy. It's not your job, it's the job of the government. But previously, another commissioner, same company, same employee, ruled in favor of the employee. So that's how interesting our labor law is evolving. It's about fairness and equity, nothing more, nothing less.
Thank you very much. Osborne Molatudi, labor lawyer and managing director at Molatudi Attorneys.